Greetings and welcome everyone to the Toward Resilient Futures Speaker Series, Part 6. I'm Jeremy. To begin, I would like to acknowledge that Portland State University, Limal, and Columbia. We are grateful to be guests on these lands. Acknowledging territory shows recognition of and respect for Indigenous peoples, both past and present. Recognition and respect are essential elements of establishing healthy, reciprocal relationships and developing a sense of place. This is a critical time to emphasize that humans and the environment are inextricably connected, especially during the global COVID-19 pandemic, and while wildfires threaten health and safety here in Portland and across the US West. Indigenous relationships with their ancestral lands can help folks recognize how humans and the environment are one. Let us work together to honor their lives and ancestors, their descendants, and our own heritage. Thank you. I'm now excited to share with you all a little bit about our new emerging emergency management and community resilience program. This program is Portland State's timely response to the hazards that surround us here in the Pacific Northwest. And this degree is one of the first in the country that connects emergency management to community resilience and makes that the nexus of what we do. Our goal is to serve the different aspects of the disaster risk management cycle, or what we call the disaster resilience cycle, by thinking about training both the next generation of the workforce, as well as having our program be a resource for community to inform them and build their practice at all stages of disaster management and response. The Emergency Management and Community Resilience Program at Portland State focuses on teaching both skills and theories that will train students to be engaged in different pathways in emergency management, both locally, regionally, nationally, and internationally. Our goal is to work in parallel with Portland State's strength of working with community and doing community-based research by providing our students the opportunity to work on actual hazard and disaster issues in the disaster resilience cycle as part of their graduate training, and also meet practitioners that are in the trenches and learn what the fundamental skills are that folks need in order to engage in this emerging field, especially at the nexus of emergency management with community. Our faculty has expertise from across the country and also locally, and we engage in different projects in the disaster risk management cycle, often cross-cutting and from a multiplicity of disciplines. Our program is transdisciplinary with 6 different disciplines that feed it. Those are anthropology, communication, geography, geology, urban studies and planning, and public administration. And through a core curriculum of those transdisciplinary courses, our students can then move through more than 100 different electives and cater their degree to the particular issue, pathway, community, methodology, approach that speaks most to them. Also, our program uses an equity lens, focusing on the fact that disasters often impact the poor and marginalized the most, and often reinforce existing issues that were already there before these events occurred. And through that, we hope to change the representation of who works in disaster management and how different communities are served through an awareness of this diversity and the power dynamics associated with how hazards and disasters act on different vulnerabilities to create disasters. Our program has multiple offerings that I'd like the community to know about. We have a master's degree that's 53 credits. It's a 2-year program aimed at training practitioners to work in the field of emergency management with multiple pathways that folks can take utilizing our interdisciplinary core and then going outwards towards personalizing their own methods and field specializations. We also have a graduate certificate that offers some of the from our research active faculty and allows students to navigate through the core according to the interests that they have. It's also a ladder to the master's degree if students are interested in starting with the graduate certificate and moving forward. This is great for folks who are already engaged in professional spheres and would like to have more training, but don't know if they can make the commitment. And lastly, we have a non-degree professional certificate that has 8 modules that are 4 hours each that are aimed at community members that want more than maybe a public talk like this, but don't exactly have the time to go back to graduate level education. We offer something in between to learn both the nuts and bolts of emergency management and also how to think critically about terms like vulnerability and resilience in your own context for taking these topics and courses. Our speaker series will be ongoing, the one that you are experiencing right now. And I ask you to return back to that website if you're interested in any of the previous talks that we've had. This is part 6 of a 7-part series, and we'll be posting them there as well as on our website. So please check out the speaker series. We've posted all the links in the chat, and we hope to keep everyone involved in our community. Having emergency management and community resilience serve as a resource in the community, not just to train the workforce, but also for folks to come to us for training, for education, and as a resource on progressive values on how to engage emergency management and community resilience with an equitable lens, which the talks today are going to speak to very much. So I'm hoping that folks will be interested in taking these next steps with us. We have our first cohort of students coming this fall for the graduate degree programs. We had our first non-degree program that just finished this past spring, and we'll be holding the non-degree program annually and the graduate program 1 cycle of admissions each year, bringing through a cohort effect of emergency management practitioners. So here we are in part 6 of the Toward Resilient Future speaker series. And I just wanted to speak a little bit about the journey that we've taken thus far in this series. The goal of this series was for us to present cutting-edge methodologies and theoretical approaches in urban and rural communities that took a systems perspective, looking at hazards and disaster ways. We wanted to give our audience a taste of interdisciplinary looks like and some of the challenges involved in us communicating across disciplines under a theme, which is the way the emergency management and community resilience program is set up. I also want to say that this program and this speaker series could not have come to be without the partnership with the Initiative for Community and Disaster Resilience, ICDR, through the Center for Public Service, which you'll hear about at the end of the talks today. Our talks in this series started with an in-depth look at rural and indigenous disaster recoveries in Nepal, and looked at how different multivariate statistical methods could be matched with community outreach to engage in disaster recovery interventions at different scales. We then were honored to hear a talk by Scott Burns where he gave us a vocabulary for hazards in our areas, from quakes to floods to mudslides and landslides and more. And with that vocabulary really showed us a trajectory of our awareness of these hazards in this area and how policy has followed or lack thereof to mitigate them. From there, we had the honor of having a talk on the anniversary of the triple disaster in Japan on March 11th, which was also the debut of the Shake Alert system here in the region for our earthquake preparedness. That talk gave us a walk through disaster recovery at different scales on a community-based level that also included a Portland State student program that continues and from both a public administration and an economics perspective, and very rich. Also shared with us how different disasters cascade from anthropogenic disasters as well as what we call natural disasters, which came to be when an earthquake created a tsunami and hit the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant in Japan. From there, we scaled out and gave everybody a taste of what we can offer on a broader scale, looking at communicating science risk and looking at communicating specifically these topics during COVID. And Dr. Frank and Dr. Solovsky gave us a taste of what communications does to share with us how hazards and disasters information is shared, how people react to it, what are the best mechanisms to do so. From there, we had to talk about urban forests and different empirical indicators for trying to understand what resilience means in an urban context. And Dr. Shandis really gave us different perspectives on how to look from bottom up and top down ways of urban forestry and what benefits there are and opportunities and constraints exist in urban forest contexts, especially here in Portland with his longitudinal work. So that's a lot of stuff so far, and I'm really happy that those 5 parts could be presented to everyone so that folks could get a taste that these are aspects that will occur in all of our core courses, and these are our core course instructors. This then brings us to our 2 talks today that we're so excited to share. When we have 2 talks, it gives us an opportunity to give even more content. We're going to have both talks follow one another, and thereafter, we'll have a facilitated question and answer. It's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker today, whose talk is entitled Separating the Wheat from the Weeds, Resilience Fixes and Transformative Resilience in Response to Climate Disasters. This talk will be done by Dr. Jola Ajibade, who is an assistant professor of geography at Portland State. She applies an environmental justice and political ecology lens to study how communities and cities respond to climate change and their capacities for adaptation and transformation. Specifically, she examines the politics of adaptation, demonstrating how historical injustices, state practices, relocation programs, and utopian solutions to climate change intertwined with exclusionary planning policies and development patterns to undermine marginalized communities. Dr. Ajibade articulates multiple solutions and pathways to climate adaptation, including partnering with grassroots coalitions, frontline communities, indigenous groups, social entrepreneurs, and small businesses. Dr. Ajibade's work has been published in a variety of journals and featured in Science Friday, NPR, Yale Environment 360, and Vice. Our second talk today is entitled Resilience, an Evaluation Thinking Perspective by Dr. Eric Einspruch, an adjunct professor in the OHSU-PSU School of Public Health. Dr. Einspruch is the principal of ELE Consulting, LLC, an independent research and program evaluation firm. Over the past 35 years, he has conducted a wide variety of studies to inform policy development and program improvement. Dr. Einspruch is also an adjunct professor with the OHSU-PSU School of Public Health and with the PSU College of Urban and Public Affairs, or CUPA. Among his recognitions, he received PSU's first Adjunct Faculty Excellence for Research Award. His service to community has included leadership roles in volunteer professional associations and emergency preparedness groups. It is an absolute honor today to welcome both of our speakers. I ask you to please put your question and answer in the Q&A place and not the comments. I am now going to introduce Dr. Ajibade to give her talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, for that introduction. I'm gonna try and share my screen. Okay, let's see. Trying to navigate a number of things here. Thank you everyone again for being here. It's really an honor to share this work that I've been exploring a while and to share the results. Oh, perfect. I have to go back. Yeah, I hope you can all see my screen. Perfect. So thank you again. It's really a pleasure to be here to share some of this work that I've been thinking about, working on, and just really trying to understand what's going on in cities. And it's just, you know, I'm always excited to talk about this. And so the title of the talk, I've been going through separating the wheat from the shaft, but also the idea of building resilience. And what does that really mean when we say we're building resilience? Because of course we know there are multiple definitions of resilience and what it means to different people. So that's not really what I'm looking at in this work. What I'm actually looking at is what do we do on ground when we say we're building resilience, and how does resilience itself manifest beyond the theoretical conceptualizations and policy goals that people put in place? And this image that you're seeing before you actually, and in some ways, embody some of the things that I'll be talking about. The image shows how different buildings seem to be floating in the air and sort of disembodied from the ground. And that's what some resilience strategies are actually doing. Or strategies that are supposed to be resilient, but then they allow for the diversion of capital into these types of buildings in the name of building global cities. And you will see how that plays out in this talk today. So for this work, I'm actually exploring whether strategies that are adopted after mega cities are transforming cities in the ways that make the city more egalitarian and more responsive to impacts of climate change, or whether those strategies are just really allowing for reinforcement of what people call capitalist urbanization, really just the diversion of capital into different buildings. And I'll be looking at this in the context of Manila, which is where I've been working for a while. And many of you might have visited Manila or not, or maybe you've seen the city on TV. It's really a huge area. It has about 13 million people. And when I was there and you were in the car as a visitor, sometimes I wasn't driving. I was often in what we call Grab. Here we call it Uber. They call it Grab there. And you would be worried that the next car coming towards you, they're going to eat each other. It's just it's very densely populated, but also the traffic is just really a lot. And you're thinking you're going to get into an accident at any moment. And somehow it doesn't happen because people really know what they're doing. And so it's just really a city that is vibrant and lively and fun to be in, but also very densely populated and challenging even as a place. And you can see how built up the old spatial area is. And another important thing for us to remember about Manila is also the fact that the region is highly vulnerable to natural and climate-related hazards, whether it's typhoon, heavy rains, sea level rise, but also it's exposed to earthquake. So there is the combination of topographic and human-induced factors such as rapid urbanization and population growth and human settlement patterns that has made the area, and certainly people living in parts of Manila, much more vulnerable to those natural disasters and climatic disasters. And I do want to situate Manila within the broader global context. This is a report that came out from the IDMC, that's the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, and in their reports, they actually talked about the number of people that were displaced in 2020, for instance. It's about 40.5 million people. And people often think it's really conflicts that displaces people, but this report shows that actually it's the disasters that have been displacing people. And in 2020, that was even more prominent, where 30.7 million people were displaced. And if you look at this area, the weather-related displacement was about 30 million. So that's a lot. And some of the cities or countries, I would say, where people were displaced, again, right after India is the Philippines. So really, the Philippines particularly is exposed when it comes to climatic disasters or weather-related disasters. And certainly, Manila metro area is one of the areas that is also exposed. And another challenge with Manila is also a city that is socially it has this social divide when it comes to wealth and poverty. So this is an area in Manila, is an area view of total Manila. In general, about 4.5 million people live in informal settlements in Manila. And the population, of course, of many of these people, they move there because they're looking for opportunities in the big city, but then they come in to the metro area and they end up in this informal settlements. And there are a variety of them. There's so many of them, some in Manila City, some in Quezon City. Quezon City is the biggest city actually in Manila. And this is another picture of Tondo, Manila. And this is a picture of Payatas, where I also walked. This is an area where both of these areas, Tondo and Payatas, there's lack of tenure for people. The housing conditions is really poor. And this dump site here is also an area close to where a lot of people live, where they earn a living, from this garbage site. And oftentimes, there is often biogas coming from these garbage sites, there's stench coming from it, but people go there to sort out some of the garbage and to pick what they think might be important that they could sell to earn a living. So it's really a place of deep poverty when you go to some of these informal settlements. So when I visited, what I was interested in understanding was what happens after a mega disaster. How do a city build back? And I went there in 2018, which was almost 10 years after this Typhoon Ondoy occurred, right? So Typhoon, well, people also call it Typhoon Kestana. And this is a category 5 storm, which dumped over 340 millimeters of rain in 6 hours, flooding the old metropolis and causing over 244 million in infrastructural damages. In the whole of the Philippines, the number of people affected were about 4.9 people. And in Manila alone, more than 500 people were killed, right, just because of this particular incident. And also 529 people were injured. So it's really a big disaster. So when I visited, I wanted to know what has happened since then. You know, of course, Manila has experienced several other typhoons since Katrina, but then how has the city evolved even to date in response to this particular issue? And how have the city also evolved in response to other displacements, climate-related displacements? And so that's what I wanted to know. Because the work that I do, I often bring, you know, the theoretical things we learn in class into the grounded work that we do in the field. I know a lot of people who explore this type of work, they often ask the question, resilience from whom? When we're building resilience, resilience to what? Resilience for whom? And people typically use a range of approaches to study and understand this. Sometimes people use environmental justice approach, sometimes people use social vulnerability, and sometimes people use both. Right, the social vulnerability approach, you know, you think about, you know, what's the race or ethnicity of people who are affected, the class, the gender, the education, poverty, how does this influence exposure of people to different hazards and disaster? Or you can combine it with the issue of environmental justice. Where are the amenities located or infrastructure located in the city that allows for people to be able to withstand the impact of disaster? And where are the garbage sites, like the one I showed you, where a lot of the poor people are living near those areas, and why are their home, or why is their home situated near there? So you could use this combination of approaches to understand how does environmental justice and social vulnerability factors shape the neighborhoods, exposure of different neighborhoods exposure, and how does this link with issues of planning and development patterns, and issues around investment pattern in different part of the city, and how does this produce or link to issues of inequality in terms of the investments, the planning, the land uses, the material wealth of people in different cities. When I was in Manila, I actually lived in Makati City, which is more or less one of the wealthier area, and I could see when I'm in Grab and we drive from Makati to Manila city itself, or to Quezon city, you can literally see the differences in wealth and the differences in the topography of the area, and also in the types of people you come in contact with. And so all of the planning and development patterns, you can see it physically, how it changes depending on how you move through and how you move through the cities, because it's about 16 cities that come together to create Manila Metro as a whole. And often we also think about how these different issues, the social vulnerability, environmental justice, the planning, and the inequality, how does this then intersect with the different systems we already have in place? So the transportation system, the stormwater system, for instance. And one of the key things when Ondoy happened, the government, particularly the president at the time, was blaming the poor that they were living all around the stormwater areas, and they were surrounded, that their homes and their informal settlements surrounded the bay, and that they were the cause of the flood. And so that thinking, or that discourse, also shaped what happens after, when they were implementing resilient strategies. So how do these things intersect with what's in place, but how do people then use those languages to talk about who is the cause of a disaster and who is not, and how do they plan resilience? And so this is typically the dimension, or this is typically what a lot of people do when they try to study these inequities in the ways in which disaster impacts different communities. But what I really do in my work, I go beyond the social vulnerability and environmental justice approach to thinking about the how of resilience, right? So after this has happened, how is it that the city itself, how was the city itself produced in the first place? and what stuff is city made of in such a way that it allows for this sort of injustices to be part of the natural evolution of cities. And oftentimes I also think what is destroyed or interrupted, in the metabolism of cities when a disaster occurs. And then when that happens, what stuff emerges as adaptability or resiliency, right? And what, in many cases, what is also the strategies that are implemented in the name of resilience, right? So I for this particular one, I didn't use that combination of social vulnerability or even social or environmental justice. What I use is what we call an urban political ecology approach, which is to look at city from a system perspective, from a different perspective, in this case, looking at how cities themselves are a form of exploitation of the environment, the way they are built, but also a form of exploitation of the people, where those whose labor build the city are often the people that end up living in those informal settlements, right? So urban political ecology, the way it looks at things is to look at how these issues are structurally produced and maintained over time through the ways power and resources and capital are circulated in the city, and how that metabolic flow itself reproduces structures of power in cities. So these were the things that I was thinking about when I went there. And I came up with this idea around, when the disaster happens, what else happened? Typically, when you think about cities, this circle you're sitting in here, you could also call it neoliberal city. Most cities are neoliberal cities, or you can call them capitalist cities. And certainly Manila is one of those cities where the labor, the energy, the water, the house, and all of those things are metabolized in ways that they are transformed and turned into ownable and tradable commodities, often in the interest of capital, right? But the interesting thing though is when disaster happens, these opens up opportunity to shift and change the system. If you look at this cloud that you see here, disaster is one of the things that can allow for the interruption of what is in place in the city, allow for breaking it apart and then rebuilding. Another thing that could allow for that is political regime shift, where you can, vote new people into power to allow for change in how the city will evolve going on in the future, or grassroots uprising, like we've seen in Portland here about Black Lives Matter and other types of uprising to challenge what's in the system. And that is the same thing in Manila as well, where you see disasters and even grassroots uprising challenging what is evident or what the city has always been. And so after the disaster happens, and this window of opportunity creates that new ground to think or rethink how the city will evolve. The next thing is that people talk about, we need to implement different strategies. We need to find ways to build back better. That's what some people say. We need to find ways to actually build a city differently or not. But then they begin to suggest all kinds of solutions. And so these solutions is what I've been looking at in my work. I'm looking at what solutions are really solutions and what solutions are actually reinforcing, not just reinforcing what is the system, but actually allowing for further accumulation of capital by a few. And I saw a variety of them, which I classified and framed as resilient fixes, right? So I developed this concept of a resilient fix to look at or to talk about the numerous implicit and explicit socio-spatial, socio-ecological, and socio-technical orderings and solutions that allow for the reworking of this urban metabolic circulation in the interest of capital and power. And they do this and they use this to create new frontiers for capital, as you will see in the work that I will show. Also, they use technologies to do this. And again, you see new spaces of devaluation and accumulation being created through this resilient fixes. So I started to look at that and how these fixes actually reinforce the capitalist urbanization that is in the system. So where I started from the work is to look at the neoliberal system, which is the capitalist system that is there, and how does this resilient strategies, which is typically in this case fixes, reinforce this urbanization system so it doesn't allow for any change. And then there are, on the other side, there are efforts of people to reclaim, to reclaim the land, to reclaim the resources from capital, to challenge the system and to shift and change it. And so I see that also happening in Manila, where people are trying to use different socio-institutional approaches to change the system, use resistance strategies, fight for collaborative governance, some of which work, some of which do not, but I'll show you a few of them. And so these type of approaches allow for trying to shift the metabolic system of the city towards this egalitarian urbanization, which is really what a lot of people want. But so there's often this tension between the resilient fixes and the sort of resistance strategies, and also sociocultural institutional change that can facilitate egalitarian urbanization, but they are not quite happening. So there is that tension constantly going on. That's why you have it as a cyclical diagram. And so when I was on ground, I spoke to people in Quezon City, this big area, and then the Manila city, and spoke to people, planners, and this city experts, and certainly a lot with people in different informal settlements. That's the Bengal, Salingan, Payatas, all of these places that I showed you earlier. And of course, to understand how the system works, you need to navigate this using different types of data points, right? You can't just speak to one expert and think you know everything, right? So I had to do policy analysis, trying to understand what's the policy in ground, how did this, who created this and how, focus group discussion. I attended also like town hall meetings, just observed what people, politicians, local politicians are saying, and who are their audiences and how are these audiences responding to these politicians. And just really observing and listening to people and trying to understand what's going on or what has happened since 2009 till 2018 when I left. And a number of things I saw, these are the core findings I'll quickly run through because of time. A number of things I saw was, number one, there was new laws right after that typhoon happened in 2010. They created a new law, a set of laws, not even one, new disaster risk management law to address some of the problems that was observed. Then new climate change laws, both in Quezon City and at the national level. There are several laws that were implemented just really to respond to that disaster and to prevent further one in the future. But one interesting thing that I found was initially the disaster risk management structure was actually centralized, where the government, that's the national government, they have a central government who also sits in Quezon City, quite frankly. And the government gives the instruction of what to do when a disaster happens. And, sometimes they mobilize the army, sometimes they mobilize regular civilians on what to do. But right after Ondoy, they realized that that centralized system of response does not work and didn't allow for effective response to the disaster. And so after that, they decided to decentralize that disaster risk management structure and to give more power actually to local actors, to give more power to the local governments, to city governments, and to people at the barangay level, and allowing different people at the barangay level is the smallest district unit in Manila, for those who do not know. And so, and to give them not just the power to act in terms of planning and response and recovery, but also to invest, a lot of money into that. And so there was the internal revenue allotments. They created about 5% of the internal revenue allotment that goes to the national government goes back to planning for disaster, and each of this money is just broken down between the barangays and the local government and then the city government. So a lot of investment in decentralization and backing that with funding. So that was helpful for a lot of people. Then there was also the argument about changing the land use practices in terms of, not building near the coast or not building near the bay or river or water areas. So that was implemented. But the question is, who was removed and who remained? Those are some of the things that I'll be talking about. And then there was this new technology that I found, not only in terms of their command system where I visited, but I also saw CCTV cameras every barangays that I visited. And I found that a little strange. Then I asked question, what do you guys use the CCTV cameras for? There's so many of them. They said we use it, monitoring as that, localized as that, so that when the information that comes from the national government, if that particular, let's say it's raining heavy and it's not raining heavy in Barangay Silangan, they can monitor that and distribute the information from a very local based perspective, which seems really reasonable. So there was that, but I'll talk about what that meant in terms of the dual role of that CCTV camera. And there was managed retreat, which is really the relocation of the poor from the riverine areas and from the bay and moving them to the outskirts of the city. That was another thing that was implemented as a resilience strategy. And there was also the resilience award and funding. So they asked different communities to come up with what they felt would be helpful in terms of creating adaptation strategies and resilience strategies, and they will come up with different projects and the government will fund it. So all of these things were implemented, but the question is which one had what power and what power do those different resilience strategies add on different people and on the city as a whole. So I'll just rush through a few of them because I'm saying that I'm almost 20 minutes, but I'll run. The big one was this issue of managed retreats, which is really the removal of the poor, and they call it the great cleanup. Like if we can remove all the poor, all of the problem in the city will be better, and we'll be better off. Same story in Manila City, same story in Quezon City. That was the rhetoric or the discourse. And this managed retreat, I see it as a social resilience, a socio-spatial resilience fix, in part because number one, it targeted the urban poor mostly or largely. But it did it in an interesting way where the poor themselves were made to be part of the conversation of their own displacement. I'll talk about what that means by why I use the word displacement. Because they create the governments in association with some of the poor groups, Urban Poor Alliance. They created this Upland Lacans program, and the goal is to relocate about 100,000 people from Manila, Metro Manila, quite frankly, to the outskirts. And a few people would be allowed to remain within the city if they can find land to build new structures or new buildings for people to live. And so the relocation plan is to move people to social housing outside of the metro, and to give them a mortgage pathway to home ownership, which all seems all good. And I think that was partly why a lot of people supported it at the beginning. The government gave 50 billion pesos towards this. And it all seemed like it was going to be good. But then when the implementation came, it was a different story. Number one, only a few people were relocated within the city. The large portion of people were moved to the outskirts of the city, and they were moved to areas that people found to be problematic. Number one, many of the housing looked like a shell of a house, was just the structure itself. There was no access to water, electricity. There was no security. There was, in fact, rampant theft because people didn't have, sources of livelihood. So a lot of people were stealing each other's materials. I mean, people would cook rice that they want to eat, and then the rice would disappear. And women were also accepting food in exchange for sex, and that created a domestic violence from husbands. And so the relocation that was meant to help people become resilient started creating all of the social problems. But also the other interesting issue is that in terms of the actual focus of the government, which is to remove people from areas that are dangerous and move them to safer areas, for many of the poor who were relocated to the outskirts of the city, they didn't feel that the places where they were relocated was safer. They in fact said, you moved up from what you call the danger zone, and now you moved up to a death zone where we don't have social services or livelihood opportunities. And these areas are also prone to floods, landslide, and some of the areas were actually on earthquake fault lines. So that was a challenge for people. And so many of the people started saying, living in the shanties in Manila were in fact a better life than the relocation itself. So it became a problem where people were displaced by climate-related hazard and now being displaced again. They felt displaced again by this relocation plan that is supposed to be a resilience strategy that was meant to save them. And this is an image of where another image of another relocation site that people were asked to move to. The selection of this relocation site, quite frankly, people were not involved in decision making about the selection or the development of the site. And even though the housing units, general housing units will cost in Filipino peso is about 450,000 Filipino peso, which is about $9,000. So you may think, oh, it's not that expensive, but for a Filipino local who doesn't have a job, that's a lot of money for people to have to pay back in mortgage over a period of time. And so a lot of people find it challenging that they were moved to these places that are flood prone and they didn't have the resources to even pay the mortgages. And another issue, of course, is some of the people who built these structures, particularly the corporations, they were given tax cuts to build these types of structures and really with nothing else. So they had a lot of incentive to build this. But for the people who were moving there, they felt that this was nothing, like this was not the kind of resilience that they would have wanted. And another interesting thing is that when people were moving, even though they were given incentive to move, they were like, don't take any of your things, don't take your clothes, because we don't want you to make the relocation site ugly. But then people got here and realized that, they're moving to a place that's not as good as what they had where they left. And an important thing to note is that the National Housing Authority, which facilitated this mobility of people, the agency, once people move and accept the social housing, the agency automatically, once you get there and you accept the housing, the agency assumes a corporate character, where they move from just being, a facilitator of social housing to being a rent collector. Like, where's your rent? Where is your rent? That's what people started facing. And it became problematic because people didn't have the resources to even pay for it. And so some people who've been writing about this call this metropolitan accumulation by peri-urban relocation, because the money that will be accumulated from these types of rural relocation strategies is actually being accumulated by people who are living in urban areas, whereas the poor themselves will have to live here, don't even have the resources to survive in this location. And another important thing to remember is also that many people who were asked to move, because of the lack of job, they now have to move to the city. I mean, they have to find their way to the cities to get new jobs. And so this changes the socio-spatial configuration of people's experience with the city. So if you're living in, let's say, Bulacan, it takes you like 4 hours or 5 hours to get to anywhere in Manila in a jeepney. And so again, the money you get from the job that you have, let's say you get, I don't know, 5,000 pesos, you have to spend a lot of money on transportation, and you spend a lot of time on transportation. And that's another problem that the urban poor were facing. And these types of strategy creates this social spatial divide where the city is supposed to be for wealthy people, and those suburbs or those outskirts are supposed to be for the poorer people. There is this reinforcement of order and disorder, healthy and poor, danger. You can live in those areas because according to the government, it's not that dangerous, but for people, it was just as dangerous as even living in the city. And so these were some of the things that people saw or experienced. And there were some of the folks that I spoke to in the who were city planners. They admitted that they didn't think that was a good strategy. At least one person admitted, he said, in our rush to relocate people, we lose attention of other social needs apart from shelter, and we create a second disaster. So as she said that, another person who actually experienced this said, we're not necessarily against relocation, but he says if you transfer to a far place and you can't eat anything there, you die there too. So the idea of saving people from climate disaster and putting them in a place where there is no food, there is no livelihood, it's both for people, it's both of them are exposing them to different types of debt, but it's debt. And so a lot of people returned back to Manila after that. Lots of people returned, and other people who did not return also started challenging the government because they noticed that in parts of Bulacan area, there were housing that were created for the army, but the army felt that the housing was beneath them and that it wasn't built to their taste and they were not going to live there. But the urban poor, those types of structures are actually structures that they want. And so many of them started, created this Occupy, they're called the Kadamay group. So they created this Occupy movement to take over those army buildings that the government has been empty for like 3 years or 4 years and nobody was occupying it. And this was really an opportunity to recognize some of the roles of urban poor activists and housing activists in challenging the system, where people are not just waiting for NGOs or local government to do the work for them. They're actually mobilizing themselves and demanding for a pro-poor agenda that is aimed at equitable resilience and for choosing buildings that they felt were better. But of course, as people were doing this, the government framed these people as anarchists and framed them as communists, from people from communist parties. And there was this back and forth with the government, but the people refused to leave. They literally just sat in front of many of the houses and said, this is the better housing for us, we can stay here. So a lot of people have framed the Kadamay's work as sort of like a fresh or breath air into the dynamics of the urban poor politics, where the typical liberal attitude to the urban poor is often condescending, like they are poor, we don't care about them. And so the liberal politics often focus on NGOs and local government, but this case, the poor themselves are saying we're not victims. We can fight and we can challenge the system, and we can demand for what we think is right. And a lot of people started doing that. So that happened on one hand. But as that was happening, there was also another thing that was happening, which is on the side of the government, where they were also, where they moved the poor away from, they were also creating new mega structures in those places, which is what I call the socio-ecological fix. Well, retreat was happening, land reclamation was happening in parts of Manila. Like, this is what is proposed to be built on the bay, even though they claim that, the poor cannot live there, but then the rich can live there. So they're building this Manila City of Pearl, Solar City, and all kinds of cities, several of them. And the goal is that it will create jobs, to create tourism or whatnot. And so this image, I'm just rushing through it because I think I'm really, I should try and wrap up because of time. And so these structures that this image you see here, these are all of the proposed projects. Many of them are funded by private investors from China. And then the yellow ones are the ones that are already implemented. And then you can see that all of the areas where they're trying to implement the project are the same areas that were heavily flooded during Typhoon Ondoy or Storm Ondoy. So you wonder whether these projects are really about resilience or about just accumulation of capital. Same thing after 2012, those same areas where 2013 Typhoon Agabat, same area where they are building is the same area where you had a lot of these choke points when the Typhoon Agabat occurred in Manila. So it makes you question why the government have approved the construction of those mega structures in those areas. But as they do that, this is the mayor of Manila at the time when I was there, and he was like, we're celebrating all of these new imageries and these new buildings are going to make the city better. And he was really just celebrating and say, yeah, it would arrest the poverty in the old city and make things better. And then that happened on one hand. And then there's the other issue about, I told you earlier about the surveillance, that everywhere you go, you see surveillance. And this was true. And this is not a command center at the national or state level. This is a command center at the barangay level, meaning like district level, like in your neighborhood. So you can imagine every single move that people make is monitored. But one thing that I observed was that not only is this command centers, not only are they used to monitor hazard, they have now also become a surveillance to monitor people. And so a lot of the information from here are also transferred to the police. And between 2016, I think, to 2019, more than 20,000 people have been killed in the name of war against drugs. So the Duterte government has asked people to provide them information about anyone that's engaged in drugs. And you can imagine drugs typically in many countries should be treated as a public health issue, but in this case it's treated as a criminal issue. And so they've been killing people, and that surveillance is supposed to help with hazard monitoring is in fact helping to also facilitate this monitoring of people and eventual killing of people. And a lot of people who were killed were actually dumped in this Pasig River, which won like the World Award for the cleanest river because it was declared biologically dead, but then was revived. But now lives are being dumped, or bodies are being dumped there. Again, people are rising up and challenging that system, challenging that socio-technical fix and how it is intersecting with this issue of war against drugs. I'll just rush through. I wouldn't talk about that. So I'll wrap up quickly because of time. And I just want to focus on what I think in Manila that has really prevented the city from transforming. You can see that people are challenging it, but some things have prevented the city from transforming, which is really a very narrow vision of the future, patronage, corruption, all of this. And of course, this populist leader was voted in right after the disaster happened, and it continued to reinforce the system. So there is a role that these different red things play, and I can speak to them during the question time: voting and pro-business agenda, all of these things, state capture, how they play a significant role in maintaining the system, in reinforcing the resilient fixes, including the CCTV camera that plays a dual role. And in another city, this is the Quezon city, there were some resettlement within the city which worked out for people pretty well. And in this case, some of the things that people talked about that made Quezon city more different from Manila city, and that people felt that the resilience strategy, since some of the resilience strategy being implemented in Quezon city did work for them, is because of this inclusive vision for the future, which again, the leader in this case had that. It was also very populist, but he had a very different approach. And the voting approaches here, people were focusing on voting for people who they felt would help to shift the system, to change the system. These population in this place were much more youthful population. They also had a higher education, in many cases based on documents that I explored. They had a pro-poor agenda. All of these things played a role in ways in which the differences you will see between Manila city and Quezon city played out. So I'll just wrap up by saying, from the poor, some of the questions I heard from people when I asked them, like, for you guys, what is your vision for a transformative future? What would you like to see? And what people point out to me is really just this section here, this quadrant here that talks about people-oriented development, pro-poor retreat plans. Even if we have to retreat, it must be in our favor, and it must be better housing, robust integration into urban planning, things like different types of ideas. But what you really see that is happening on ground is a lot of the resilient fixes, which is really about growth-oriented development, over-reliance on technological fixes, forcible eviction of people or coercive eviction of people, silo plannings, all of that. So that's really the majority of what you see, at least in part of Manila city and some part of Quezon city. But where people want to be is in that transformative quadrant. So I'll just wrap up there by thanking Portland State's resources that I received from Faculty Enhancements Fund and PSU Vision 2025 for this one. So I've just stopped sharing my slide, and I will stop there because of time. Thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Ajibade. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Einspruch.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so excited about PSU's new Emergency Management and Community Resilience program. I think it's an opportunity for students and faculty and community members to work together to address some critically important issues. Today I'm going to talk, let me share the screen. Today I'm going to talk a bit about evaluation thinking. I'm going to touch on resilience. I'm going to talk a little about climate emergency as context, and I want to get to some contemporary ideas in evaluation. What I'll talk about today draws on the work of others in an effort to highlight some key points which I offer for your consideration and in support of our common interests. I'll provide a number of resources, a number of citations. Of course, there are many more. What I want to do is provide examples of the kinds of things that I'm thinking about, as well as some specific things I'm interested in, and I hope that you are as well. I want to start with, what do I mean when we talk about evaluation? There's not one common agreed upon definition of evaluation, but there are several, and they have a lot in common with one another. Here's a couple of them. Evaluation is the systematic assessment of an object's merit, worth, probability, usability, safety, significance, and/or equity. Here, when we talk, this is one that you'll commonly encounter, or some variation on this. And when we talk about merit, we're talking about how well does the thing that's being evaluated, we'll call it the evaluand, do what it's intended to do. How well does it function? Independent and just of itself. When we talk about worth, we talk about how well does the evaluation function, how about its merit, in the context of some need and in consideration of costs, whether those are monetary or non-monetary costs. Another example is the second one that you can read on the screen. The thing that's a little different here is its emphasis on the purpose of the evaluation and its use by a variety of stakeholders. The stakeholders being anyone with a vested interest in the program or the evaluation itself, and use being the key. The evaluation, from this point of view, and I agree with it, needs to be used if it's going to have been worth doing. An evaluation that just gets produced and set aside, maybe we should have spent the resources. A couple other points about evaluation. One is that we can view it as a transdiscipline. It's a discipline in and of itself, but it also provides tools and services to other disciplines. You might say any other discipline. It's a little bit similar to, say, statistics, right? If you are doing a study and part of your study is to take measurements on some variable, and part of your analysis is to take a mean on those, an average, a mean on those measures, you're going to add them up and divide by the number of observations in their mean. Doesn't matter what you're counting. That's the approach to do it. So in that sense, statistics is a transdiscipline. We also like to think of evaluation as well. It's important to note that evaluators can draw from a wide variety of defensible approaches, designs, and methodologies. If you ask me, what's the right way to do an evaluation? The answer will be, it depends on the context. What are we trying to learn? For what purpose, to be used by whom, in what ways. Evaluation, we sometimes think of answering these questions. What, so what, and now what? What is the evaluation? So it's a descriptive statement. So what? Did it have merit? Did it have worth? Now what? What are we going to do with what we've learned from this? And I want to mention that it's nice when the evaluation begins at the time the program is being planned, so that the evaluation and the program planning can be integrated, can inform one another, and be carried out in a timely manner. Evaluation is something that we do informally on a routine basis, maybe even a daily basis. For example, when we're making choices among purchase options, we think about which option will be best meet our need. Whether formal or informal, the logic of evaluation follows these steps. We're going to define the criteria that we'll use to evaluate the evaluand. We'll set the standards of performance on those criteria. We'll measure the actual performance, and then we'll synthesize the results to reach an evaluative judgment. So the Azam article that's cited gives the example of evaluating a car. Suppose we want to evaluate a car. What criteria might we use? Well, it might be how many people it carries, its fuel economy, its appearance, its price, its safety rating. And once we have these criteria, we'll then determine the standard of performance for them. So, for example, if one of the criteria is fuel economy, what standard would be acceptable to us in this context for fuel economy for the car? Finally, then we measure the actual performance of the car. And finally, we review the criteria, review the performance against the standards, synthesize the results, and make an evaluative judgment. If we do this for multiple cars, we can compare them then. And it's also important to keep in mind that these criteria might not all be equally important. All the ones I mentioned, safety might be considered the most important one, and even if the vehicle scored great on all the other criteria, if it did not score well on the safety criteria, well, then we want to buy a different one. Now, evaluators need to tend to more than just the logic of evaluation. We need to think about how they conduct themselves as evaluators. They need to think about what competencies they need to have. They need to think about how to engage in a competent way when working in different cultural settings. They need to think about what standards would be used, what criteria would be used to assess the quality of the evaluation. So here's some statements from a U.S. perspective that U.S. evaluators and others perhaps make use of. It's also a broad evaluation community. There are many opportunities to benefit from professional development opportunities from these different communities. And they exist at different scales. So we have international organizations, International Organization for Cooperation and Evaluation, for example, Eval Partners, for example, and these often have subgroups. For example, Eval Partners has a subgroup of Eval Youth, which is young professional or emerging evaluators who are not just entering the field, but also entering leadership positions and doing some really interesting things. We have national associations, for example, our American Evaluation Association, and it contains a variety of topical interest groups. We have local associations, for example, local affiliates of AEA, and we have one here in our area, the Oregon Program Evaluators. Now, evaluation thinking is a little different than evaluation itself. Here's a couple of definitions. The first one being this sort of thinking reflects the ability to creatively arrive at specific solutions to a context by determining what combinations of methods, tools, techniques, and theories are appropriate in light of that context. This is back to how would we go about thinking of creating an evaluation? Well, it depends. We think about these kinds of things, making those decisions. So rather than being about the product of some evaluation thinking is about what we learn and what skills we develop through the process and experience of doing evaluation. That is, it's the thinking about evaluation. So I want to turn for a moment to the notion of resilience. This is also a term that has different meanings and different definitions. I want to look at a couple. One that appeals to the kind of thinking I've been doing. It comes from Zoe and Healy, who frame resilience as the capacity of a system, enterprise, or person to maintain its core purpose and integrity in the face of dramatically changed circumstances. You see how this has been incorporated into the ideas behind the EMCR program, which goes a step further by acknowledging that you might want to, in a situation where there's an opportunity to change or to transform, that may be better than just going back to where things were. This is from Stockholm Resilience Center. There's definition, and then they also brought in this notion of resilience thinking. That is, thinking about resilience and thinking about how to build resilience. And they mention three pillars within resilience thinking: this notion of complex interdependencies between people and ecosystems, that humanity is now influencing the earth on a scale akin to nature. It's really remarkable if you think about it. And this is called the Anthropocene. And we embrace learning diversity and how to adapt to complex challenges. You might think of it with this sort of diagram. A system can be structured, a system gets structured and organized with feedback loops that keep it in its state. And if there's a shock to the system or a long-term change in the underlying conditions, the feedback loops can change in nature, and there can be, and the whole thing can shift to some different state. Often quickly and often with large change. Maybe an example of I was thinking a little bit about this. Think about maintaining temperature, a person maintaining temperature, right? Human body needs to stay at a certain temperature. Too much hot, it can vary a little, but it can't be much hotter, it can't be much colder. If you get cold, things happen, you start to shiver, you put on a coat. If you get hot, you start to sweat, you take off the coat. These sorts of changes can keep the system in the state it's in. But if there's a shock or a deterioration of the condition over time, it may no longer be possible. So the same is true with businesses and their environment, or relationships among people, or natural systems. So why is all of this important? We're hearing more and more about climate change. We're hearing more and more about climate emergency. This is the context that we live in. We see this from the scientists. We see it from the indicators that they present to us. The Ripple article begins with, scientists have a moral obligation to clearly warn humanity of any catastrophic threat, and we tell it like it is. And then they carry on to say, we, with more than 11,000 scientist signatories from around the world, clearly and unequivocally state that planet Earth is facing a climate emergency. That's what the scientists are saying. Climate science. You want to look at some indicators? EPA has a really interesting site. NASA has an interesting site where you can watch how indicators have changed over time. And then article I've cited here from Nature, which makes a similar point. But the Nature article, and this is an interesting read. I think about this term emergency, and the Nature article talks about emergency as being some function of risk and urgency. And they say risk is defined by insurance as probability multiplied by damage. So how likely is something to happen? How bad is it going to be if it does? And urgency is defined in an emergency situation by how much time it takes for a reaction to an alert and how much time is left to avoid a bad outcome. So if risk is high and urgency high, you say we have an emergency, And those authors, looking at the indicators, say, indeed, we do. Now, for me, I'm looking for opportunities for hope, and I'm looking for opportunities for agency. And there are many opportunities for climate solutions, and they exist in many areas. For example, this very Ripple article that I first mentioned looks at indicators in several different domains: energy, soil pollutants, nature, food, economy, population. And for each of those domains, they offer things that can be done. Project dog travel, do state and local climate plans for opportunities to act and make changes. But what about as individuals? And there are indeed many things that we can do as individuals. We can prepare for disasters. It's the preparedness part of the site that Jeremy showed at the beginning. Be informed, make a plan, build a kit. Lots of great resources, ready.gov, the Red Cross. We know to engage with the whole community. We know that building community strengthens resilience, and there are lots of volunteer opportunities for those with information. We can build personal resilience. This is from American Psychological Association website. They've defined resilience a little bit differently, but they offer concrete, specific things that can be done to build resilience. Build connections, foster wellness, find purpose, embrace healthy thoughts, seek help when you need it. These are things we can do. We can build community resilience. These are a list of items from an action checklist from the RAND Corporation. It's one example of things that can be done to help build community resilience. And we can evaluate. When we're planning where to invest our resources and efforts, let's also at that time think about evaluation. We need to, based on, going back to the evaluation thinking slide earlier, we would ask these kinds of questions to think about how we evaluate whatever it is we're doing. What's being evaluated? What theory of change is this based on? Why do we think doing that will make a difference? What values should be used to determine the merit and worth of the evaluator? Given those values, what criteria should we use? Given those criteria, where do we want to set the standards for performance? And from there, what sort of approach do we want to take? How do we want to design it? What do we want to measure? And so forth. How should we go about synthesizing the results to reach conclusion and judgment? And how should those be communicated? And who should be involved throughout this process? And in particular, using the results and for what purpose? In other words, let's think about how to include evaluation as part of this solution-oriented approach to addressing emergency management, addressing resilience, addressing community. Which brings me to some contemporary notions. Michael Quinn Patton, who's been a long-time leader in the evaluation field, has developed this approach to evaluation. The name and the approach is inspired by the iconic shot from space of the Earth, which if I recall correctly is in the early 70s, where we could look for the first time and say, oh, that's it. And we were all there. From that, Michael's this thinking about and developed an approach to evaluating global initiatives and transformation systems toward a more sustainable world. And I thought about this when I was listening to our previous speaker talking about the transformation fits, and especially the one slide where the transformations were in the upper left-hand corner. There are ideas here that may be very, very interesting. There are 15 overarching principles, overarching principles, operating principles, transformation principles. And in particular, I want to mention a couple here. One is this notion of global, the kind of contraction of global and local. So thinking about things globally, thinking about things locally, thinking about how those two levels interact and evaluating across that system. And also this notion here of skin in the game. Acknowledge and act on your stake and how the Anthropocene unfolds. This is a little different for evaluators to think about. We usually think about being in as external observers to change rather than internal participants in change. So this approach calls from going from independence to interdependence, to making values explicit and transparent, and to identifying our role in acting within the corresponding sense of urgency. I think there's some really important stuff down here, very relevant to the topic. Some other things we're also seeing, at least I'm also seeing, more writing about indigenous approach to evaluation. This is an area in which I am learning and don't have a lot to say about it other than I think it's very, very interesting and very important, and here's why. When we think about different perspectives, it gives us the chance to think about what's the nature of reality anyway? What's the nature of knowing anyway? What's the nature of how knowledge is gained? What ethics guide our search for knowledge and our judgments about what knowledge to search for? You see in the quote from Sean Wilson's book that describes a different notion than what we're commonly accustomed to, where we think when we see knowledge as something an individual has that we can go and gain, and John's describing an approach where knowledge exists from the relationships themselves and emerges from there, and that there's accountability to those relationships. There was a recent entire issue in the American Evaluation Association's introduction for evaluation on this topic. There's a recent entire issue of the Canadian Journal of Program Evaluations journal, and I think there's very interesting things in here. And in the Canadian Journal, there's mention in a couple places about learning to see from two eyes, where one has the Western understanding and the other has indigenous understanding. And if we can have those perceptions, if we can hold them simultaneously, we can gain a depth of knowledge that we don't gain from either one alone. It's very much how binocular vision is, one eyes. And I think this may be perhaps similar to what we gain by learning another language or through people-to-people cultural exchange, an opportunity for a depth of understanding. I think there's some really important things here for the kind of topic of community resilience. And I also want to mention Beth Parsons' work, another leader in the evaluation field, with an approach called visionary evaluation, which takes the position that values are at the heart of bending the curve of our current planetary trajectory towards a more sustainable, equitable future. And these authors put forth sustainability and equity as values, stated and transparent, essential to guide us through the Anthropocene. And from there, we have this list of principles and how to proceed. So from all of this, I take these goals. We're facing a climate emergency. Without change, consequences will be ever more serious. There are many actions we can indeed take to help ensure, or at least work towards, a sustainable and equitable future, and our actions can be effective. We're all in this together. Let's do our best. Jeremy.
Thank you so much. Dr. Hiro Ito is now going to facilitate our question and answer. Please put your question and answer in the Q&A box in our chat, in the Zoom features. Hiro.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. And thank you very much, the speakers, for very interesting lectures. So now let's open the floor for questions. But before that, let me introduce myself. I'm Hiro Ito, Professor of Economics and the Chair of Economics Department at PSU. And I'm also a co-director and co-founder of the Initiatives for Community and Disaster Resilience, ICDR. ICDR is co-organizing today's event and other speaker series with EMCR starting from this year. Professor Masami Nishishiba and myself have founded ICDR in 2017. Our mission is to provide a forum where experts from academia, the governmental sector, and nonprofit or for-profit organizations can exchange information on and discuss emergency management, disaster preparedness, and other disaster-related topics. So as one of the activities, we have organized a lecture series. And now, as I said, starting this year, we are joining EMCR for the lecture series. So with that background, so let me take some questions from the audience. I don't see any questions. Okay, let me see. I don't see any questions on the Q&A folder. Okay. Okay, there's one question. How does one integrate these worthy approaches with typical investor-oriented accounting and or financial analysis and evaluation systems? In terms of practice, how does one establish a chart of accounts?
Could you ask it one more time, please?
Okay. How does one integrate these worthy approaches with typical investor-oriented accounting and or financial analysis and evaluation systems? In terms of practice, how does one establish a chart of accounts?
Right. Well, there are approaches to cost accounting and cost benefit analysis, cost effectiveness analysis, and it begins at least with record keeping. What funds are involved, where are they involved, and how do they flow from one account to another? And I think the first step, there's no reason not to be in concept. There's no reason not to be able to identify that. Count up the dollars and see which accounts they're in and see which accounts they go to. And then from there, you can describe and consider what effect those funds may or may not be having. Are they having the effect that they are intended to have? And so on and so forth.
Okay. Jola, any response?
Oh, I don't think the question was directed at me.
Okay, all right.
Because I didn't talk about accounting evaluation. I was looking more at a more systems perspective to how things evolve. So
Okay.
yeah, I thought that question was for Eric.
Okay, as a matter of fact, I just got a question for you. So let me read it. Thank you for your presentation. Could you talk a little bit about how your work was received by municipal government officials in Manila? Did you find that it made a positive difference?
Well, that's a good question. This paper is actually under review, so it's not been published. But there was a paper that I co-published looking at some of this issue, comparing Lagos and Manila. I know for those who were on ground, it was sort of like an eye opener for them to see that you know, the people who, and I'm not the only one, I should confess, I'm not the only one who have documented that people were returning. And so I would say the local government, and I would say the city government take.
Jola, we lost you.
So that conversation.
Can you hear me?
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, I can hear.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the conversation about what done is still on, is very going. And another thing that I know is one of the challenge for the government as well, it's not like they mean to just throw people out and put them in those areas, is the fact that the many parts of Manila are actually built up, as I showed you at the beginning. So it's sometimes hard to find areas where you can build those new structures. So that's one challenge. The land availability is one challenge. However, for a lot of the poor people, even when you build places outside of the city, so you build them on the outskirts and some provinces that are closer to metro, the structures is what people are talking about. The types of building is what they're not happy about. And the fact that there's really no opportunity for economic livelihoods there. And another thing I didn't show, because there's so many parts to this work, I didn't just show it in this presentation, is that there is another planned retreat or planned relocation. And this planned relocation is targeting government officials and mostly people who work in a want to build this, what is called the New Clark City. And the New Clark City is outside of Metro Manila, but what they are doing with that project is that they are planning it right from the ground up, putting trains, putting sports centers, housing, and it's going to take them about 20 to 30 years to get it done before they relocate to this emergency and government offices there. And so some of the conversations from the poor is that if you can do that, to plan it properly before you relocate people, why didn't they do that for the poor? Why is it that they had to build a quick housing and just put a quick structure and then say, okay, go, don't take any of your things, just go. So those are some of the inequities that is becoming more evident and people are talking about. And for what I know, especially with Kadamay City, I know the government, at least when I was there, the mayor at the time, they're listening to this and they're hoping to make changes.
Okay, thank you very much. Here's another question. How might the work of Robert Costanza relate to this work? Robert Costanza is an ecological economist.
Is that for me or is that for Eric?
I guess both of you.
I'm honestly not familiar with that work, so I can't answer the question. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with Robert either, but the work that I was writing and talking about, I was actually looking at it from David Harvey's work and what is happening in many cities around the world, where the solutions that are supposed to address issues, and many people have not written about this in the resilient context, it's just coming up. But in many other economic contexts, people, especially Harvey and others looking at urban development and evolution of cities, have written about how these different strategies are, they use this concept called spatial fix, how capitalism reinvents itself by producing new spaces for accumulation. And so what I'm seeing in my work is that resilient strategies are becoming that opportunity of that avenue for capital to also reinvent itself by allowing for the construction of new structures on the sea, on the bay, while simultaneously leaders are claiming that this is going to address climate change. So it's really using our base concept to push our understanding of bringing a more critical perspective in resilience thinking. That's really what I was trying to do. So I'm not really familiar with Costanza's work per se.
Okay. All right. There's another one. Probably this is going to be the last one, given the time constraint. So here in the US, what public agencies, if any, have these types of policies and programs on the way? If so, which agencies, so that we may contact them to learn about how they have established their contracts, agreements, programs, project management, and similar implementation needs. Thank you.
I think that's for Eric.
going to have to ask you to read it once more.
Okay. Here in the US, what public agencies, if any, have these types of policies and programs on the way? If so, which agencies, so that we may contact them to learn about how they have established their contracts, agreements, programs, or project management, and similar implementation needs?
I'm confused because I'm not sure what these programs is referring to.
So
Okay.
I can, if the question was directed at me, I can speak to some example of resilient fixes that I've seen in the US. A prominent one is really in the insurance industry and in Miami, where the insurance industry, particularly the boom and bust in the industry, where the industry, as you know, accumulates a lot of money over time because we all just keep paying insurance, housing insurance, as you know. And then when disaster happens, what then happens is that they have enough money to then pay people out, and they pay people back so that people can also build in these areas that are flood prone, that are along the oceans. And so if you think about my conceptualization of resilient fit, you see how it is playing out in that area where housing that are supposed to not be built, because of repetitive flooding along Miami, they are being built because the insurance industry is facilitating the construction of those houses there, because you build there, they give you money, you complain, you build it again. And so it's not addressing climate change, it's just recycling the inequity, not just the inequity in the system, but recycling the problem in the system. And it's giving the insurance people money, but also not addressing the problem on ground. So that's another way to think about how resilient fixes plays out in the context of the US. And there are several other cases one might think about. And I guess for me, the important issue is really to look beyond how these projects are playing out on ground, to think about how do we really need to create programs and projects that do address equity issues, that do really allow for people to adapt to climate change, rather than reinforce the problems that create exposure for people, both for the rich and the poor. But obviously, it's the poor that suffers the most when there is a disaster. Oftentimes, they're the ones that do not have that insurance, and they are the ones that will be asked to relocate or be forcibly asked to retreat from the coast, while the wealthy people are paid by insurance or even paid by our own taxes, because we pay collective taxes that goes to FEMA, and then FEMA pays people back either to rebuild their homes or sometimes pay people to retreat. But the question is, who is getting to retreat and who is staying on the coast? So those are some of the inequities when we're thinking about this issue around resilient fixes and climate adaptation going into the future.
I would pick up on that and say, health agencies, emergency management agencies, resilience offices, at both state, local, and national levels. National Science Foundation is doing work in this area. Private foundations are doing work in this area. I mean, there are a lot of agencies that are incorporating this kind of thinking and this kind of work. And I guess my suggestion would be perhaps something like whoever asked the question, what is your area and what are you interested in? And then seek out the agencies that are involved in that area and those interests and see what they're up to.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. It was quite interesting. So let me hand this back to Jeremy.
Thank you, Hiro. I want to thank everybody for a wonderfully engaging and provocative set of talks today. I think these talks really show the breadth of the EMCR program, thinking critically at the systems level, and also very grounded in thinking about techniques and evaluation and pushing the envelope on the ground there. I want to thank both of our speakers today for their talks. Their video for their talk will be posted on the EMCR Speaker Series website. We are taking a break for the summer. We'd like all that wonderful knowledge that we shared to sink into your heads over the summer. And we will have a final talk in this series in September with a theme on water, with talks by Alita Cantor and Heejun Chang. Thereafter, our speaker series will change and will be focused on practitioners sharing their lessons learned from the field. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and we hope you have a wonderful summer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.